Hello, everyone. I'm Renee Barnett, and this is What's Left.
When I say, hey, hey, what's wrong with you? I want to turn you round to that just to see you smile. You don't gotta be there, want to be more.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to What's Left. We have a wonderful show planned for you today. Going to learn a lot. I'm really excited about our guest. But before I introduce her to you, I want to bring on my co-hosts, James Martin and Sean Halsall. Hi, guys.
Hi. Good afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
How's everything across the pond, guys?
Quite sunny, actually. Weather-wise, I can't speak politically, but certainly in terms of
please don't.
in terms of weather, it's pretty glorious there.
Absolutely, yeah. Politically, seeing people being locked up for protest and whatnot, but again, the weather here is quite nice as well.
Well, politically, Sean, you've just won an election recently, so that's one good thing we can say.
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks for that. Yeah, it's another 4 years of being stuck in the institution.
Yep. Well, today we have with us an amazing guest, and I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Bandy Lee is a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, and a world expert on violence. He taught at Yale University School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years before recently transferring to Columbia and Harvard. She became known to the public by leading a group of mental health professional colleagues in breaking the silence about the immediate past U.S. president's dangerous psychology and publishing the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. The volume proceeded from an ethics conference she organized at Yale School of Medicine, which led her to consulting with over 50 members of the U.S. Congress. She's currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition, the largest professional organization to address the problem of dangerous leadership and its contribution to a mental health pandemic. There's so much more to Dr. Bandy Lee's bio, but I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm probably bringing up other elements a little bit later. But welcome, Dr. Bandy Lee.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we couldn't be more thrilled to have you. I think what you have to say, your work is crucial at this time. I know we were talking a little bit off camera about sort of the state of everything. And we're not just talking about the United States. This is, we've got issues, in Europe and around the world as well with these sort of autocratic leaders, pushing their agendas, and they seem to be gaining ground. It's very scary. Now, when you started your work toward that book about Donald Trump, how did that begin for you? Were you just personally noticing on the news and thinking, oh my gosh, I can diagnose this guy?
Well, usually I don't diagnose public figures, but I did note signs of danger. And dangerousness is not a diagnosis. It is a mental health assessment, but not a diagnosis. And it's something that I do routinely in my professional practice. I'm what is called a forensic psychiatrist, which means I work at the interface between psychiatry and the law. And so I work with dangerous individuals with criminal histories, and also work on preventing violence from a public health perspective. And so I did notice some, of course, numerous signs of danger. It did not take a long time for me to notice. In fact, I believe within a minute of watching him interact with his followers at his rallies, I think alerted me to the fact that he resembled greatly a lot of the dangerous individuals that I treat and evaluate and warn against. And but how this all began was the morning after election. Starting at around 8 o'clock in the morning, I was inundated with phone calls and messages and email messages. Basically, because I'm an expert on violence, people were sensing the same fears. And I felt that at that point, if I have dedicated a career to studying and preventing violence, would I turn away at the sign of perhaps the greatest violence that we could ever confront as a nation and as a human species? That's when I decided that I should not draw such sharp distinctions between fields, because in fact, it is a duty of a medical professional to place safety first, and if there are signs of danger, to act. In fact, it doesn't matter whether we're involved in a patient-provider relationship. It doesn't matter if we see a medical emergency out in the street, for example. We actually need to take them on as a patient and act. So given those kinds of trainings that I received, it made no sense for me to stand back and pretend that this wasn't happening. And so that's why, after 20 years of very apolitical practice, I suddenly emerged into the scene, I suppose you could say.
And it wasn't received very well by Yale University, I understand.
At first, it was received well. In fact, it was, we were received extraordinarily well by the public. In fact, Macmillan, which is one of the big five publishers in the country, didn't have enough books. It had not prepared for a multi-authored special knowledge book to be so popular that, in fact, we were told that had there been enough books, we would have been #1 and not #4 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Goodness.
That's how how responsive the public was. And we were told that the public was thirsting for this kind of knowledge. And we heard all kinds of stories of people driving across the state to find the only copy that they knew that was in that state. So that was the beginning of the launch of the book. And then within 3 months, we were the #1 topic of national conversation.
When did you start to feel the backlash?
So I was invited by all the news programs and all the network and cable channels. And then, and that was when the American Psychiatric Association stepped in and spread the disinformation, I will say, quite deliberate disinformation, that we were being unethical. Instead of meeting our responsibility to society, which we do have, clearly in the preamble, the first 2 lines of our ethics code says, we have a responsibility to patients as well as to society. And so our responsibility to society is almost as important, if not as important, as our responsibility to patients. But the American Psychiatric Association basically was coming out and saying, psychiatrists are only supposed to see patients. Donald Trump is not a patient, and therefore we had no right to speak about him. We can only speak about him after we've examined him and gotten consent to speak about him. That's actually not at all. That is true when you have a patient, but he's obviously not a patient. Our patient, in fact, is the public, and our responsibility is to society. And when we warn against dangers to society, that's not making a diagnosis, that is preventing or attempting to prevent harm to society. And that's one of our obligations. And that's something that they failed to convey. Well, even after that, Yale University was very receptive. In fact, the year after the book came out, the chair of my department in his State of the Department address, actually affirmed how Yale was in favor of protecting free speech and academic freedom, and gave me as an example of responsible speech. It was only 3 years later, when Alan Dershowitz made a complaint to Yale, that within 72 hours, that Yale sent out a message to me saying, we need to talk. That came from the chairman's office. Since I knew him well, it sounded like just a private talk. But when I arrived, there were several other faculty members there. Well, I didn't mind. We just had the talk, but the talk was kind of very strange, very very non-conducive to any discussion. Simply, they were laying out what I had done, repeating the APA's disinformation. Anyone trained in psychiatry knows that this is not the correct interpretation of the ethics guideline they were purporting to uphold. But since, well, just like the era of Donald Trump, when something is so blatantly untrue and so blatantly contrary to science and practice and whatever we've learned in psychiatry, then it's so out of range that there's no starting point to even have a discussion. So, so what happened after that was that I was fired from Yale, and the termination letter said that that they were terminating me because I no longer had a teaching role, but they were not giving me a teaching role because they were terminating me. So kind of went a circular argument. It was only 4 months later that, upon my continued urging, that I received a letter finally explaining why I was terminated, and they gave the Goldwater rule as a reason. But again, it was a repetition of the APA's public campaigns of what of its unprecedented interpretation of this ethics guideline. So,
excuse me, Dr. Lee, and that Goldwater rule has to do with not diagnosing a person that you're not seeing as a patient. Is that correct?
So the Goldwater rule, by their public discourse, says that you're not supposed to speak about anybody you haven't examined and haven't gotten consent to speak about. That's not what the Goldwater rule says. The Goldwater rule actually says that we have a responsibility to improve our community and better public health. So we should speak out. In fact, it's the opposite of what they've said, that we should participate in activities that improve the community and better public health. That's the Goldwater rule. But when we're asked about a public figure, just don't diagnose. Speak in more general terms. Don't diagnose. And that's perfectly fine. I've never diagnosed Donald Trump, and you don't have to diagnose in order to warn against danger. In fact, danger and unfitness are assessments that don't always require a personal interview. In fact, the person you're interviewing would, if they are truly dangerous, would tend to lie or deceive and misrepresent themselves. Even certain personality disorders manipulate the situation so as to beguile you, and you could be led. In fact, studies show that in such circumstances, a personal interview takes away from the accuracy of an assessment. So these are assessments that are not done for a patient, not done for the individual, but done for society. And society has the right to know if it is in danger, or if someone it is electing is fit for office. And this is absolutely, these are routine assessments we do for employers, for any kind of mechanism.
Well, when excuse me, Dr. Lee, I was just thinking that, well, we find on news programs, for example, experts coming on to discuss leaders, to discuss politicians, economists, business leaders, and giving their opinion. Some of them have psychiatric training. Some of them are from a medical background. That seems to be at odds with your experience, where if this was an opinion given in a news program, that's fine. But if it's an opinion in a published work, for example, that seems to be an issue. It doesn't seem to make too much sense. I smell a rat, in other words. Sorry, Sean, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, obviously Donald Trump is an extreme sort of case in this, but how prevalent do you think it is in world leaders, both in the USA and across Europe, to have some of these traits, to be sort of verging on psychopathy? I mean, John Ronson wrote a book, The Psychopath Test, where he talks about people in business leadership roles, but also politicians. And I wonder if almost you've got to have some of that sort of dysfunction to end up in these positions. And so how much on the extreme scale is Donald Trump in this?
So in terms of dangerousness, I have alerted that he was the most dangerous person in the world because of his position. Dangerousness is not about just the individual, unlike a diagnosis. So in other words, Donald Trump, if he were removed from his position, he would not be so dangerous. Or if he were properly contained, he would not be dangerous. But given the situation that he was in, he was essentially, he had the power to annihilate all of humankind and had the psychology to desire to do it. And now we heard more recently, a few months ago, I learned that our book, our compendium, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, was purchased by the White House Chief of Staff at the time, John Kelly, at the beginning of the Trump presidency, and he consulted the book, considered it an owner's manual of the president, who turned out to be far more difficult to manage and far more dangerous than he ever imagined. And I think that is the kind of knowledge and clinical background that professionals can offer. And in fact, the fallacy is the notion that professionals should not speak about their professional opinion in the public is actually that belies the obligation that we as experts need to share our expert knowledge so that the public can be informed about relevant issues and benefit from the special knowledge that is available to humankind in order to help govern themselves. And so that, to me, is the crux of free speech and academic freedom, as well as our obligations as citizens. Professionals are not excluded from citizen obligations.
So, Dr. Lee, there was, you've just reminded me of one of my favorite books, and I know that you've quoted the author a number of times in your own work. And this was Snakes in Suits by Robert D. Hare, who created the famous Hare test and all of this. We see, or we're beginning to see at least politically, a lot of people with very similar sort of narcissistic traits as Donald Trump, not just ascending into office, but actually seeming to emerge across society generally.
Yes.
I mean, how do you see the relationship between, was it a case of Trump is enabled by people with these tendencies already, or is Trump actually, and other people, Erdogan, Putin, that kind of idea, are they the enablers of this malaise in society?
Yes, there are many dynamics that are happening, of course. But when we started speaking out, it was to alert the world that Donald Trump was not an individual problem. He was a public health problem, and his psychological dangers would soon spread. The longer he was in office, his dangers would spread to social, cultural, geopolitical, and civic dangers. This is what we said beginning the second year of his presidency, because we saw that he was, because of the intervention of the American Psychiatric Association, our consultations with Congress were no longer effective. The 25th Amendment, which even the drafter of the 25th Amendment said that he intended the amendment to be driven by medical data, and yet the APA said it had nothing to do with psychiatrists, medical doctors. It was a purely political amendment. Well, of course, even making that comment itself is going beyond one's expertise. They have no right to speak about what counts and doesn't count in the political sphere, but we do have an obligation to speak about what we see and what could be relevant. So after that, the 25th Amendment became non-viable within the first year. Then it was impeachment, and many Congress members were preparing to hold town halls with us, speak with us, and that is when the Speaker of the House at the time, Nancy Pelosi, shut down all discourse, lest it stigmatize, be seen as partisan. So I know she did drive the impeachment when absolutely pushed by all the other members, but she resisted for a very long time. And then the second impeachment, we stated that it had to come within 24 hours. Well, it came within 48 hours, so that was still pretty good. But we did say that the conviction truly had to be driven, not fizzled away as it was. It really had to be aggressive and speedy in order to prevent, well, my main concern was not the criminal justice part. My main concern was the psychological contagion part, that the spread of his criminality and psychological impairments could only be contained if intervened with rapidly. The decision that was later made not to call witnesses, not to hold many more hearings, but to simply close it down was a decision that we couldn't understand, nor can we understand the slowness of the Department of Justice. Now, is this all connected with other enablers who have to benefit? Well, it's probably a whole range. Certainly when Donald Trump was first in office, that was the time to remove him. In fact, I believe he expected himself to be removed. He, above all, knew that he was unfit for office. Do
you think so?
Excuse
Do
me.
you believe that he knows that he's unfit for office?
Deep down, our mind is actually built of layers. And so what we're conscious of is actually a very minuscule part. Neuroscientists say it's about 2%. So 98% of our mind is actually unconscious. And so most of that unconscious part is dominated by, is plagued by a sense of inferiority, insecurity, lack of self-esteem, full of doubt, and that's what he's fighting against when we see him grandiose and exaggerating about his accomplishments. That's what he's fighting, and so that's what resonates with other people who are fighting similar impairments. So the thing to do is not to reward such pursuits of absolute power and domination and unlimited positions in society, but rather to keep them out of these positions. That's actually the first step we need to take to their management and treatment. But we didn't do that with.
I was just going to say we have seen this actually such an important point when Donald Trump contracted COVID. And there was that famous scene of him wheezing on the balcony. But behind the scenes, it later emerges he was terrified of being ill, or whatever else. I think that's such an important point that, in fact, he's battling his inferiority. Dr. Lee, I'm curious, do you see any comparisons with Trump and other figures in history?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
yeah. I've been treating these individuals all my career, having specialized in evaluating and treating violent offenders. Most of the people I see are with these kinds of personality disorders, developmental defects, and these kinds of impairments that land them in jails and prisons and make them an absolute menace, whatever part of society they're a part of, be it the family or company or government that they're a part of. But the shift that I've seen in society over the last 25 years of my career is that they've gradually gotten out of jails and prisons. They're less commonly found in correctional facilities and more commonly found in leadership positions such as CEOs, legal professionals, and politicians. And yes, it's a sign that we as a society are failing to contain these individuals and to give them proper treatment, because the last thing you wish to do is to give them power. And no matter the rhetoric they will give you of how competent they are and whatever you're putting up with is a fair exchange for all that they're bringing you, in fact, it's all simply a mirage. They're destructive wherever they. And they're actually not able to use the talents they do have because of their disorder.
right. Dr. Lee, as you noticed, as we all have, certainly in the United States, and maybe it's this way in other places as well, but people just generally acting crazy. People on airplanes, people in supermarkets, the whole mask debacle with, people, not wanting to wear their masks and all this. Do you see that as part and parcel of this Trump contagion? Or, a lot of people are attributing mental health problems to the fact that we had a long lockdown from the pandemic. But of course, if you want to go that route, then the pandemic could have been handled much better. I think, it was handled worse here than just about anywhere. And
you're pointing out that all these issues are interrelated. And the point is that if we have a dangerous leader, a leader with a dangerous personality, dangerous psychology, then the result is that we will see dangers all across the board, everywhere. And it is a fact that, we've surpassed 1.1 million COVID deaths in the United States. I'm not sure that any one of those deaths would have been was necessary, given that the United States had contained epidemics in the past effectively and prevented pandemics from happening. A pandemic only happens when an epidemic spins out of control. And we know for a fact that Donald Trump removed so many safeguards for a pandemic, depleted the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that was no longer the organization that it had been the last 100 or half a century at least, preventing all kinds of epidemics for the entire world. So the 6 million COVID deaths, or close to 20 million deaths attributable to COVID around the world, could have been possibly prevented. Now, it's mind-boggling to think of this, but we also almost lost the entire planet, or at least human beings on the planet, human civilization, because there were also reportings within the last few months even that John Kelly, the White House chief of staff I mentioned, he managed, it was reported on how he managed to stop Donald Trump from using nuclear weapons against North Korea. He was intent on doing it. He was heading in that direction, and apparently using knowledge from our book, pulling on his narcissistic strings, he was able to draw him away from it. One thing that is not commonly discussed is that dangerous individuals are often the most malleable, in that you can guide them and lead them out of the dangerous behavior very quickly and easily, because many of their behavior come out of a developmental compromise, in that they have been arrested or stunted in development, and therefore it is very much like dealing with a child, where they are looking for guidance. They feel unsafe by themselves, and they can't fully control their behavior, and so they're looking for others to do it for them.
Is that why he's always insists on loyalty and, because he needs those people
Yes,
to
right.
make himself feel okay? One
Yes.
other thing, I'm wondering, did you notice that as time went on with Donald Trump, he, sort of, if this is the right word, sort of grew into that
Yes.
that role. And I started to notice a change in like the way that he would speak, and he started to speak in this sort of sing-songy tone that reminded me very much every time of Jim Jones and the Jonestown cult leader.
Yes.
Who
It's the
guided
same psychology, whether it's happening within a family, with an entire nation. It's the same dynamic. And Adolf Hitler was once called a seismograph of crowds, in that he could sense the crowd and give it exactly what it was asking for. And these personalities are very good at that, because they're constantly looking for approval, adulation. They're craving for it, and so they will know. Well, that's one way that they fulfill their cravings, but it's not a healthy way to do it. The healthy way is actually to get treatment and to face their lacks, and to face reality. But instead, if they're given power, they can avoid doing that and end up in a very dangerous place, because such urges don't stop at reasonable levels. The more power they are given, they're not able to handle power, and therefore they will abuse it and develop even grander expectations.
It's really interesting you say that, Dr. Lee, because just thinking now, almost politics and that sort of level of politics is almost like a crack pipe for someone with that need to fuel their ego, and get into that feedback loop where what bigger stroke to your ego than having millions of people vote for you to lead the free world, as it's often called, and then have these sort of cult-like following where people just completely ignore facts and truth, and believe nonsense about injecting yourself with bleach and all that sort of absolute just menace sort of stuff. But how much damage do you think this sort of the way mental health professionals like yourself are being treated does to sort of what is clearly going to be the next pandemic, the mental health problems across the world?
Yes.
How much damage is that does pushing you and sort of devaluing the work you do and your colleagues around the world with what we've got, trying to repair the damage done during COVID globally?
Yes, it's very concerning. Since I work in public health and prevention and work with perpetrators to prevent mental health pandemics from spreading, and the expansion of need for mental health from starting in the first place, it's very difficult for me to observe how the natural known consequences terrible mental health needs going unmet. And that is why we see such rampant mental health problems, especially in youth who are unfiltered and they feel acutely what is happening. But adults also, no matter our denial, we can't pretend that these things don't exist. Just as physical illness can't be pretended away, mental illness cannot be pretended away. But there is a great deal of not only dangers, but mental health problems that spread as a result of dangerous leaders and mentally impaired leaders, where their own symptoms can spread. We spoke about emotional contagion earlier, which I often abbreviate as the Trump contagion, to also emphasize just how much was caused by one individual, by placing a severely mentally impaired individual in such a position of power and exposure. It has had a worldwide effect. And as much as people thought that once people see how egregious he is and how impaired he is, that they would respond, I always warned that it would have the opposite effect. That in fact, his impairment would spread to the point where people will stop even recognizing it as impairment. People will stop caring about whether or not saying is a lie or a delusion. And there's also this phenomenon called shared psychosis. And there's we know that emotions are contagious, but symptoms are far more contagious. So when a primary person has an actual psychiatric illness, their symptoms will spread much more rapidly. And that's the kind of phenomenon I've seen treating patients in the public sector. We see a lot of patients who have severe mental illnesses and go untreated. It's not the healthy individuals in the family or the community who make the ill person healthy. It's rather the ill person who spreads their delusions, their paranoia, their violence proneness to other members of the family. The cure for this, however, is actually quite simple. You separate them. Once you separate the patient from the rest of the individuals who are previously healthy, they may look equally ill. In fact, it's quite dramatic. They may look like they have schizophrenia, just like the primary individual who actually has the schizophrenia. But once you hospitalize them and remove them from the family, the rest of the family returns to normal. And that's what we haven't seen in the nation. I kept warning that an election alone would not remove the Trump effect and the Trump contagion, that he truly needed to be, at that point, prosecuted against, and best would be to be incarcerated, removed from public exposure. But of course, what happened was the opposite. He was allowed to go on, and now he's the next presidential candidate.
So this is, I mean, we see this sort of behavior. I mean, I would argue that the mental health pandemic started long before the COVID pandemic did. But we see this behavior a lot in business, where we have business leaders who genuinely believe they're running empires and treat their staff accordingly, as if they're, personal property. I'm very curious about, I mean, we see mental health services being decimated by cuts, lack of funding. It is very much a public health issue, and yet he's seen as a very private, personal one. And that's often used as an argument to legitimize underfunding. What puzzles me is how people often vote against their own interests. Because there are lots of arguments. I mean, I would make, for example, economic, political arguments and all of this. But what do you see as is there a psychological effect that means that, well, any family without access to healthcare, without access to decent foodstuffs, without decent housing, for them then to cast their vote for someone like Trump, who very clearly doesn't care about them. What is the psychological reason, in your view, that that makes people vote for people like Donald Trump?
Yes. Well, voting against one's interests, acting against one's interests, and acting in ways that are self-destructive or destructive to others, these are all signs of pathology. It's the very definition of pathology. And you have well pointed out that socioeconomic factors, deprivation, is not divorced from diminution of one's mental health. In fact, mental health is very closely tied in with socioeconomic inequality, especially. And so I've often said that the deadliest form of violence, as well as the most potent stimulant of behavioral violence, is structural violence. And we call it violence because people actually die from relative poverty. Not so much absolute poverty, but relative poverty. And a large part of that is due to violence, behavioral violence, and mental health problems. And so, yes, once there's, so we can actually get to the source of all this, that before Donald Trump, there was a mental health crisis in society, and that the state of mental health had diminished to the point where such a leader people would be attracted to rather than repelled against. Healthy individuals are not attracted to pathology, but those who are afflicted with pathology will be drawn to individuals, actions, and circumstances that worsen their health. So it becomes actually a spiral. So that's what we're seeing.
I mean, and we've absolutely seen this. I mean, you see, in Britain, actually, just before even the election of Donald Trump, the referendum on Britain's exit from the European Union, by every sensible account, it was an act of extreme national self-harm.
Yes.
And then we see, and it was like the dominoes were beginning to fall. We then see Trump. We see, Putin. You could argue, began this with the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, and you begin to see these staggering events rapidly. And for those of us trying to maintain a healthy mental stability, shall we say, beginning to see these extreme events occur and wondering what is going on in society.
Yes.
And it's and it can be extremely difficult, actually, for people to try and rationalize what is going on in society, without actually feeling that society is somewhat beginning to break down into a very infantile, medieval, if you will, state.
We call it primitive. We call it primitive. Yeah. There are primitive drives as well as more developed drives. And in a state of disorder, one often regresses, which means one goes to an earlier stage of development. And that's usually when we don't have a coherent sense of agency, of direction, and we're pulled more by the we used to call animalistic drives, but they're essentially more basic drives.
What can we do? So if I were to go back to my students, or for anyone listening to the show, what can we do? What healthy steps can we take as a society? We're essentially discussing the fight for society in a way. Everything that we've understood as the neighbour knocking on the door Can I borrow some sugar kind of thing? That seems to have gone. There's a lot of distrust. But what can we do? What would your message be to everyone to sort of rid us of this malaise? Is it possible, do you think?
Well, first of all, don't shun mental health experts. When you have a mental health problem, well, when you need surgery, you call the surgeon. When you need mental health help, you need to have mental health professionals speaking up and speaking about explaining the phenomena we are seeing in society, because this is not a healthy state. It's not a rational choice. It is well, we need to restore our mental health to be able to engage in rational discourse and to draw ourselves more and more toward a healthier, life-affirming process. I often say that fascism is not a political ideology, it is mental pathology in politics. So if we see tendencies toward fascism, it's actually a signal should go off that we need mental health professionals. And why? It's because historians can certainly comment on what's happening and they document it very well. But who has actually intervened with these issues and practiced healing such states on a daily basis? So, of course, mental health professionals also are not experienced in working at the societal level. So there needs to be interdisciplinary collaboration, but certainly mental health experts can't be left out when we're experiencing such an emergency. And politics can't substitute it. Interpreting it in other ways will not do. When you have a viral pandemic, you have to have viral experts and infectious disease experts. When we have a mental health pandemic, we do need mental health experts. And it's becoming...
Oh my goodness.
Well, I think we've just lost Dr. Lee.
Dr. Lee. Maybe she'll be able to reconnect. But, I was just thinking about, in terms of what she was saying, and about how it seems like there's no encouragement in society, or I guess it's because there seems to be a war on education and a war on experts. And, just recently one, GOP congressman or some leader said, we don't need experts. We've had enough experts. And I'm thinking, well, I kind of need an expert. If I want to know about something, who am I going to go to? Somebody that knows nothing about it?
Absolutely.
Or am I going to go to an expert?
I think, well, interesting listening to Dr. Lee then. I mean, if we had another Adolf Hitler now with this sort of nuclear weapons and sort of capability for destruction, it's terrifying that these people could take power. And I mean, I think Hitler's probably a few steps further along the line than Trump. I think Trump's probably nowhere near intelligent enough.
Sorry to interrupt, Sean. We've got Dr. Lee back with us.
Fantastic. There she is.
I apologize for that. It was my computer.
No worries. No worries.
So,
it happens. We were just saying that there's sort of a war on education and on experts in this country. In fact, recently some GOP congressman or leader said, we don't need experts. We've had enough experts. And I'm thinking, okay, if I want to know about something, I want to talk to an expert. I don't want to talk to just some Joe Blow on the street that doesn't know any more than I do.
Well, that's what happened in the US during the COVID pandemic. It was we had the best experts in the world, all concentrated in one country, and yet our COVID deaths led everyone else was the highest of all the world. And
then there even became, Dr. Fauci became the, public enemy number one somehow. It makes no
yes,
sense.
yes.
But this is,
So that's a mental health issue.
Yes.
For me, as the sort of historian, a lot of what we've discussed reminds me, if you just take the COVID pandemic, for example, of some of the same actions that were being taken during the Black Death in Europe, or well, at least one of the outbreaks, in the late 1340s. Where people don't look to the expertise on offer at the time. Now, we know medically that, wearing a rose-scented mask isn't going to prevent you from contracting Yersinia pestis. However, there are people who, no, my friend told me that if I cut an onion, that will cure. Or, no, my friend. And it just sort of reflects on the social media nature, where we don't need an expert because, so in the UK, one of my friend's cousins was a nurse and the hospitals are empty. It's all fake.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, well, this isn't quantifiable. This isn't evidenced. This is just an opinion disguised as, look at me, I'm in the know. And what's worrying is that, for me, that sort of behaviour then led to unnecessary deaths with people who thought, well, actually, this is completely made up. And then looking at leaders who were acting as if actually nothing was going on. Of course, in the UK, we have bring your own bottle parties in the heart of government and all of this, in total disregard for any rules imposed. And with what seriousness do you follow them if those who've set them are breaking them themselves? And again, Trump's behaviour, I mean, it's so illuminating. I absolutely loved what you had to say about fascism there, Dr. Lee. That really has changed my viewpoint. But then just listening to your remarks on Trump, it's almost like if he's told not to do something, he goes and does the opposite. Don't look at the don't look at the sun during an eclipse. What does he do? Don't go out and suggest that pouring bleach or getting sunlight into your body. No, well, he goes out and does it, and it seems to be like some big rebellious kid. With a severely hampered developmental problem, as you've outlined.
Maybe it's time someone proposes saying that we don't have a healthcare system paid for in America by the taxpayer.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But yes, we have the knowledge of the past 150 years of development in mental health and psychology. We understand a great deal, especially after the fascism that swept through Europe in mid-century. We have gathered all this knowledge, but it's not available to us if we shun it. And just like the COVID pandemic, which we experienced, like the Black Plague, as if we did not have modern knowledge or technology, and use technology to spread disinformation, which was very destructive. And so we have the same thing happening with the mental health pandemic, in that we're not making use of the tools that are already available and that we've accumulated over the last 100 years. And that's why we're heading in the same direction of a repeat of what happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
And of course, it's to just say we've not got too much long left, but when we look at people in workplaces, for me, one of the big triggers is the modern workplace, the excessively long hours, the low pay, the lack of conditions, lack of any right to holidays in some countries. The demonization then of labour and trade unions for trying to argue for better conditions. And we know that when stressed out workers return home, if they have families, that is then taken out on that stress, the cortisol, etc., is then taken out upon the families. And then we know that the children of those stressed out workers then think that that's the norm. I mean, this is a giant piece, really, of lots of triggers. And I would like to think that we've at least stumbled on some answers this evening.
Well, I wrote Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul in 2020. Actually, I rushed the manuscript to publish it before the election. Basically, it was stating that election alone will not solve the Trump problem. And secondly, I outlined the solutions, and it was three-pronged in that first, we need to remove the offending agent. In other words, the origin of the Trump contagion. So removing Donald Trump from public exposure was first. The second intervention that was necessary was to rein in the cultic programming and regulate media, because social media especially is called, well, it's often described as going viral. In fact, it does have that effect, and so it has an incredible effect in helping to spread symptoms. And then thirdly was to fix the socioeconomic conditions that gave rise to this vulnerability in the first place. And if we look at the trajectory of America's mental health collectively, it follows very well the trajectory of the rise in inequality. It started around 1980, and during times of worsening inequality, also we've seen the effects in society in terms of supporting dangerous leaders, self-destructive policies, and instituting policies generally that lessen our general mental health.
Dr. Bandy Lee, it looks like we're all out of time. I'm so sorry. But if you would like to hear more or know more about Dr. Bandy Lee, go to her website, bandylee.com. And also, I would suggest signing up for her newsletter. It's really interesting. I got a new one just today, and it was very, very informative and very interesting. Much needed in today's world, not just in the United States, but all over these days.
So just running out of time. Sean, 2 seconds.
Yeah, just thank you very much, Bandy Lee, and thank you very much for showing the bravery and speaking out on this thing, because it's a great thing to do, to put your head above the parapet and sort of risk your professional career. So thank you from all of us for doing that, challenging that behaviour.
So everyone, what's left? We've got a few issues in society, maybe some answers. Politics, elections, well, it's not a 4 or 5 yearly event. It's a daily event. And I suppose in the sort of age-old tradition of Jerry Springer, we need to look after each other. So
God
with
rest
that,
his soul.
Dr. Lee, thank you very much. And I've been James Martin.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
Jane
you very much.
Barnett.
I'm Sean Halsall. This is what's left.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Dr. Lee.